Have you ever witnessed the moment when absolute power meets unstoppable justice? When a predator finally faces their reckoning? This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a promising 17-year-old boxer whose dreams were shattered by the most dangerous man in professional boxing until Rocky Balboa stepped out of retirement one last time. What happened next changed everything we thought we knew about courage, redemption, and the true meaning of strength. If you've ever felt powerless against injustice, this story will hit you harder than any punch ever could. Stay until the end. You'll never see boxing the same way again. Comment below. Have you ever stood up to a bully? Share your story and let's support each other. And if this story moves you, hit that subscribe button. We're building a community of fighters who never give up. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in Mickey's boxing gym on South Philadelphia's grittiest corner, casting harsh shadows across the worn canvas of the training ring. Sarah Mitchell, 17 years old with calloused hands and fire in her brown eyes, threw combinations at the heavy bag with the precision of someone who had found her calling. Each punch echoed through the gymnasium like a promise that she would make something of herself, that she would rise above the circumstances that brought her here every day after school. Her story wasn't unique in this neighborhood. Father gone before she could remember his face, mother working 3 jobs just to keep their small apartment, and Sarah herself carrying the weight of being the family's only hope for something better. Boxing wasn't just her passion, it was her escape route. Every scholarship scout who had watched her spar had said the same thing. She had something special, something that couldn't be taught. Raw talent mixed with desperate hunger created a combination that was almost impossible to beat. But in the corner of the gym, watching her with eyes that held too much interest and not enough respect, stood Vincent, the Crusher, Romano. At 42, Romano was everything wrong, with the boxing world wrapped up in an expensive tracksuit and gold chains. He owned 3 gyms across the city, managed a stable of fighters who feared him more than they respected him, and had a reputation for breaking spirits long before Bones. His success was built on a simple philosophy. Intimidation worked better than inspiration, and fear was more reliable than loyalty. Romano had been circling Sarah for weeks now, making comments about her potential and her special qualities that made her skin crawl. He would position himself where she couldn't avoid seeing him, would make sure their eyes met across the gym, would smile that predatory smile that made her want to shower immediately after training. Mickey, the old trainer who ran the gym, had warned her to stay away from Romano, but the aging former fighter's influence only went so far in a world where money talked louder than morals. Today felt different, though. Romano wasn't content to watch from the shadows anymore. He approached the heavy bag where Sarah was training, his entourage of yes-men trailing behind him like remora fish following a shark. The conversation around the gym gradually died as people sensed the shift in atmosphere, the way animals sense an approaching storm. "Hey there, sweetheart," Romano called out, his voice carrying that false friendliness that fooled no one. "You're looking real good out there, real good. Got a minute to talk business?" Sarah stopped hitting the bag, but kept her gloves up, her body language defensive. "I'm training, Mr. Romano. Maybe later." "Later?" Romano laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You know who I am, girl. I'm the guy who can make fighters or break them. I'm offering you an opportunity here, and you want to put me off for later." The gym had gone completely quiet now. Even the sound of other fighters training had stopped, as everyone turned to watch this confrontation unfold. Sarah felt the weight of all those eyes on her, felt the familiar surge of fight-or-flight adrenaline that she knew so well from the ring. But this wasn't the ring, and Romano wasn't an opponent she could face with conventional weapons. "I appreciate the offer," Sarah said carefully, "but I'm happy with my current training situation." Romano's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Your current situation? Kid, you're training in a dump with a has-been who couldn't cut it as a professional. I'm talking about real opportunities here, private training sessions, one-on-one attention. The kind of personal development that could take you places you never dreamed of. The way he said personal development made Sarah's stomach turn. She'd heard the stories about Romano's private sessions with female fighters. She'd seen the haunted looks in the eyes of the girls who had trained with him and then mysteriously disappeared from the boxing scene altogether. She knew exactly what kind of opportunity he was really offering. "Thank you, but no," Sarah said firmly, turning back to the heavy bag. That's when Romano's mask slipped completely. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. "Listen here, little girl. I wasn't asking. I was telling. You think you can just disrespect me in front of everyone and walk away? You think you're too good for Vincent Romano?" Sarah tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Let go of me." "Or what?" Romano sneered. "You'll tell your mommy? You'll report me to Mickey? Nobody in this gym is gonna help you, sweetheart. They all know who pays the bills around here." The silence in Mickey's gym was deafening, broken only by the steady drip of a leaky pipe somewhere in the building's ancient plumbing. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as Romano's grip tightened around her wrist, his fingers digging into the thin skin over her bones with deliberate cruelty. She could feel the collective held breath of every person in the gymnasium, could sense their fear and their shame at not intervening. This was Romano's world, and everyone in it knew the rules. You didn't cross Vincent Romano without paying a price. "You're hurting me," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her throat. She had faced opponents in the ring who outweighed her by 30 pounds, had absorbed punishment that would have felled grown men. But this was different. This was predatory. This was evil wrapped up in expensive clothes and backed by institutional power. "I'm barely touching you," Romano laughed, but his grip told a different story. "If you think this hurts, wait until you see what happens to little girls who don't know their place. You see, Sarah, and yes, I know your name, I know everything about you. You're operating under a dangerous misconception. You think this gym protects you. You think Mickey protects you. You think the boxing world is some kind of fairy tale where talent and hard work are enough?" He leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. "Let me educate you about reality. I own 3 gyms in this city. I manage 47 professional fighters. I've got judges in my pocket and commissioners on my payroll. When I say jump, half the boxing world asks how high. And when I say a pretty little thing like, you need some private coaching, well, that's what happens." Sarah tried to twist away, but Romano anticipated the movement and wrenched her arm at an unnatural angle. Pain shot up through her shoulder, sharp and immediate. She gasped despite herself, and Romano's smile grew wider. "That's better," he said. "See, that's the sound of someone learning their place in the world. Now, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. But either way, you're coming with me for some one-on-one training. The only question is whether you walk out of here or get carried out." From across the gym, Mickey started forward, his weathered face twisted with anger and disgust. At 73, the old trainer moved slowly, but there was still something dangerous in his eyes, something that remembered when he was one of the most feared middleweights on the East Coast. "Romano, you let that girl go right now. This is my gym, and I don't allow that kind of behavior in here." Romano barely glanced at the approaching trainer. "Your gym?" he laughed. "Mickey, you sweet old fool, do you know who owns the building this dump sits in? Do you know who's been covering your insurance payments for the last 6 months? This is my gym now, just like everything else in this neighborhood. You're just the help." The revelation hit Mickey like a physical blow. His step faltered, his hands dropping to his sides as the full scope of Romano's manipulation became clear. The predator hadn't just been stalking Sarah. He'd been systematically gaining control of her entire world, ensuring that when the time came to strike, she would have nowhere to run and no one to turn to. "That's right," Romano continued, savoring Mickey's shock. "Every fighter in this gym trains at my sufferance, every piece of equipment, every electric bill, every permit and license. It all goes through my people. So when I tell you to mind your own business while I have a private conversation with one of my prospects, you're going to do exactly that." Sarah felt something break inside her. Not physically, but spiritually. The safe harbor she thought she'd found. The mentor she believed would protect her. The sport she loved. It was all an illusion. Romano owned it all, controlled it all, and she was just another asset to be acquired and exploited. The realization should have crushed her, should have left her helpless and compliant. Instead, it made her angry. "You think you own everything," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You think everyone's afraid of you. You think your money and your connections make you untouchable." Romano's grip loosened slightly, surprise flickering across his face. He hadn't expected defiance, not after revealing the scope of his power. "But here's the thing about bullies," Sarah continued, looking him directly in the eye. "They're only dangerous until someone stands up to them. And I'm standing up." With a sudden, explosive movement, Sarah drove her knee up toward Romano's groin while simultaneously twisting her body to break his grip on her wrist. The techniques Mickey had drilled into her hundreds of times, not for the ring, but for situations exactly like this, kicked in with automatic precision. But Romano was faster than she expected, and stronger. Her knee caught nothing but air as he sidestepped, and his free hand shot out to grab her throat. The grip on her wrist tightened to the point where she heard her bones creak under the pressure. "Wrong answer, little girl," he snarled. "Now you've made this personal." The crack of Sarah's wristbone breaking echoed through Mickey's gym like a gunshot, followed immediately by her scream of pain and shock. Romano released her instantly, stepping back with his hands raised in mock innocence as Sarah collapsed to her knees, cradling her shattered wrist against her chest. The injury was devastating, not just physically, but professionally. A boxer's hands were everything, and Romano had just destroyed her future with casual, calculated cruelty. "Oops," Romano said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Accidents happen, don't they? Maybe if you'd been more careful, more respectful, this wouldn't have occurred. But don't worry, sweetheart. I know some excellent doctors who can patch you right up. Of course, they'll want to be paid for their services, and I'm sure we can work out some kind of arrangement." Sarah's vision blurred with tears of pain and rage as she struggled to stand. Her dominant hand hung useless at her side, already swelling and turning ugly colors. 17 years old, and her boxing career was over before it had really begun. The college scholarships she'd been counting on, the professional contracts that had seemed within reach, the dreams of lifting her family out of poverty, all of it destroyed in a single moment of violence. Mickey rushed to her side, his face pale with horror and helpless fury. "You sick bastard," he whispered, his voice shaking. "She's just a kid. She's just a goddamn kid." "Kids need to learn respect," Romano replied coldly. "Maybe next time she'll think twice before disrespecting someone who's trying to help her. Now, Mickey, I suggest you clean this mess up and get her to a hospital. And make sure she understands that accidents like this happen when people don't appreciate the opportunities they're given." The other fighters in the gym stood frozen, their faces a mixture of shock, disgust, and fear. They wanted to help, wanted to intervene, but they all knew the same truth that Mickey was learning. Romano owned their world, and crossing him meant losing everything they'd worked for. The silence was complicity, and the complicity was another kind of violence. Romano straightened his tracksuit jacket and began walking toward the exit, his entourage falling into formation around him like a military unit. He paused at the door and turned back, his eyes finding Sarah where she knelt on the canvas. "Think about what I said," he called out. "About those medical bills, about your future, about what happens to little girls who think they're tougher than they really are. I'll be in touch." The heavy metal door slammed shut behind him, leaving the gym in stunned silence. Sarah's quiet sobs were the only sound, punctuated by Mickey's whispered reassurances that meant nothing in the face of such overwhelming cruelty. The old trainer helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as they made their way toward his office and the first aid kit that would provide minimal comfort for such a devastating injury. As they passed the heavy bag where Sarah had been training just minutes earlier, she looked up at the yellowed newspaper clippings that decorated Mickey's wall. Photos of champions from decades past, men and women who had found glory and redemption in this very ring. Her eyes stopped on one particular image, a young fighter with kind eyes and an indomitable spirit, standing victorious after what the headline called the fight of the century. Rocky Balboa, the Italian stallion, the pride of Philadelphia and the embodiment of everything noble about boxing. Sarah had grown up on stories about Rocky, had watched his old fights on grainy videotapes, had dreamed of following in his footsteps. He represented everything that Romano opposed: honor over money, courage over cruelty, the triumph of good over evil. Mickey, Sarah whispered through her pain, whatever happened to Rocky Balboa? The old trainer's step faltered. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years, hadn't allowed himself to think about the man who had once been his closest friend and greatest pupil. Their falling out had been bitter and final, a combination of pride and misunderstanding that had festered for decades. But looking at Sarah's broken wrist and devastated dreams, Mickey felt something stir in his chest, a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still one person in Philadelphia who Romano couldn't buy, couldn't intimidate, couldn't break. Rocky, Mickey said quietly. Rocky's been retired for 15 years, lives up in Kensington now, runs a little restaurant, hasn't been in a gym since. He trailed off, unwilling to relive the painful memories. "Do you think," Sarah asked, her voice barely audible, "do you think he'd help me?" Mickey looked at her then, really looked at her. Despite the pain, despite the injury, despite having her dreams crushed in the most brutal way possible, there was still fire in her eyes, still fight left in her spirit. She wasn't asking for salvation. She was asking for the chance to save herself. "I don't know, kid," Mickey admitted. "Rocky and me, we haven't talked in a long time. He might not even want to see me, but maybe it's time to find out." As they continued toward the office, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows outside the gym. Romano hadn't left as completely as they thought. He was still there, still monitoring his territory, still planning his next move. He'd broken the girl's hand, but he hadn't broken her spirit yet. That would require a different approach, a more comprehensive strategy. But what Romano didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that his actions had just set in motion a chain of events that would bring him face to face with a legend. In trying to destroy one fighter's dreams, he had awakened something that had been sleeping for far too long. The Italian stallion was about to learn that his city was under attack. Adrian's restaurant sat on a quiet corner in Kensington, its weathered brick exterior and hand-painted sign giving no hint of the legend who ran the kitchen. Inside, the walls were covered with black and white photographs, not of boxing matches or championship belts, but of family dinners, neighborhood kids, and ordinary people sharing extraordinary moments over simple meals. Rocky Balboa had found peace in this small corner of Philadelphia, serving up homemade pasta and listening to the stories of working families who reminded him of his own humble beginnings. At 58, Rocky moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body bore the accumulated damage of a legendary career. His hands, once instruments of devastating power, now kneaded dough and stirred sauce with gentle precision. His eyes, still sharp and kind, had learned to see beyond the surface of things, to recognize the pain and hope that his customers carried with them into his modest establishment. He was preparing for the lunch rush when Mickey Goldmill walked through the front door for the first time in 15 years. The two men stood frozen for a moment, separated by decades of hurt pride and unspoken regret. Mickey looked older, frailer than Rocky remembered, his shoulders bent under the weight of years and disappointment, but his eyes still held that fierce intelligence, that ability to see potential where others saw only problems. "Mickey," Rocky said quietly, setting down his dish rag and stepping around the counter. "Rock," Mickey replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. The silence stretched between them, thick with everything they'd never said, all the apologies they'd been too stubborn to offer. Finally, Mickey spoke again. "I need your help." It was perhaps the hardest thing the proud old trainer had ever said. Mickey Goldmill had spent his entire life refusing help, rejecting charity, insisting that he could handle whatever the world threw at him. But Sarah's broken wrist had shattered something in him too, had forced him to confront the limits of his own power and influence. Rocky studied his former trainer's face, seeing the desperation hidden beneath the surface. "What's wrong, Mickey?" Mickey told him everything, about Sarah, about her dreams and her talent and her unbreakable spirit, about Romano and his systematic campaign of intimidation and control, about the broken wrist and the implied threats and the way the entire boxing community had been too frightened to intervene. With each word, Rocky's expression grew darker, his jaw tightening with a familiar anger. "She's special, Rock," Mickey concluded. "Reminds me of another fighter I once knew. Had that same hunger, that same refusal to stay down no matter how hard life hit him. But Romano's gonna destroy her if somebody doesn't step in." Rocky was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photographs on his restaurant walls. Images of his late wife Adrian, of his son Rocky Jr., of all the people he'd loved and lost and tried to protect. Boxing had given him everything: fame, fortune, purpose, identity. But it had also taken so much away. The accumulated brain damage that made him speak more slowly now, the arthritis that turned simple tasks into exercises in pain management, the knowledge that he'd spent the best years of his life getting hit in the head for other people's entertainment. "Mickey," he said finally, "I'm done with all that. The boxing, the fighting, the whole scene, I got out for a reason." "I know you did," Mickey replied, "and I respect that choice. But this ain't about boxing, Rock. This is about justice. This is about protecting someone who can't protect themselves from a predator who thinks his money makes him untouchable." Rocky shook his head. "There's got to be other ways. Legal ways. Go to the police, file charges. Get the boxing commission involved." Mickey's laugh was bitter and hollow. "You think I haven't tried? Romano's got judges in his pocket, commissioners on his payroll. The police won't touch him unless they got video evidence and 3 independent witnesses. And even then, it's a maybe. The boxing commission, half of them work for his gyms. The system's rigged, Rock. It's rigged from top to bottom. So what exactly are you asking me to do?" Mickey reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a newspaper article from that morning's sports section. The headline read, "Romano's prodigy to fight for middleweight title." Below it was a photo of Romano's latest acquisition, a vicious young fighter named Marcus the Mauler Thompson, who had earned his reputation by hospitalizing opponents with unnecessarily brutal beatings. "Romano's throwing a private exhibition match next week," Mickey explained. "Invitation only, big money crowd, the kind of people who bet on dogfights and think violence is entertainment. Thompson's gonna fight some nobody, probably kill him for the amusement of a bunch of rich sociopaths. And," Mickey met Rocky's eyes directly, "I want you to be that nobody." The suggestion hung in the air like a live wire. Rocky felt his pulse quicken, felt the old familiar surge of adrenaline that he'd thought was buried forever. The part of him that had never stopped being a fighter recognized the challenge, the opportunity, the chance to step back into the arena where he had once been a king. But the rational part of his mind, the part that had learned to value peace over glory, recoiled from the idea. He'd been out of the ring for 15 years. His body was older, slower, more fragile than it had ever been. Thompson was young and strong and hungry, with none of the conscience or restraint that had defined Rocky's own career. "Mickey, I can't. I'm not that man anymore. I can barely get out of bed some mornings without my back screaming at me." My hands shake sometimes when I'm tired. I forget people's names, lose track of conversations. The damage is already done. I can't risk making it worse. I know all that, Mickey said gently, and I wouldn't ask if there was any other choice. But there isn't, Rock. Romano's got his claws in everything now, and he's not going to stop with Sarah. There's other kids training in gyms across the city, other young fighters who think they're safe because they're talented and hard-working and good. Romano's going to pick them off one by one until there's nothing left of the sport we both love, except fear and corruption. Rocky turned away, staring out the restaurant's front window at the quiet street beyond. Normal people living normal lives, going to work and coming home to their families, never having to face the kind of moral crucible that was being offered to him now. He envied them their simplicity, their ability to solve problems without violence, their freedom from the weight of legend and expectation. "There's got to be another way," he said again, but even he could hear the doubt in his own voice. "Maybe," Mickey admitted. "Maybe if we had time, if we had resources, if we had connections in high places. But we don't, Rock. All we got is an old trainer with a broken heart and a retired fighter who still remembers what it means to stand up for what's right." Rocky closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of destiny settling on his shoulders once again. The morning sun cast long shadows across Mickey's gym as Rocky Balboa stepped through the doorway for the first time in 15 years. The familiar smells hit him immediately: leather and sweat, liniment and dreams, the metallic tang of blood and ambition that permeated every serious boxing gymnasium. His footsteps echoed on the concrete floor as he surveyed the equipment that had remained virtually unchanged since his championship days. The same heavy bags hanging like sleeping giants, the same speed bag mounted in the corner, the same ring where he had learned to transform pain into purpose. Sarah Mitchell was waiting for him in the center of it all, her broken wrist encased in a bright blue cast that seemed to mock her aspirations. She was smaller than he had expected, barely reaching his shoulder, but there was something in her eyes that he recognized immediately. It was the same desperate hunger he had seen in his own reflection decades ago, the same refusal to accept limitation that had carried him from the streets of Philadelphia to the pinnacle of professional boxing. "So you're the one causing all this trouble," Rocky said, his voice gentle despite the gravity of the situation. Sarah managed a weak smile. "I didn't mean to cause trouble for anybody, Mr. Balboa. I just wanted to learn how to box. And Romano decided he wanted to teach you something else." The girl's face darkened at the mention of the name. "He broke my wrist, but that's not the worst part. The worst part is knowing he's still out there, still doing this to other girls, still getting away with it because everybody's too scared to stand up to him." Rocky studied her carefully, seeing not just her current injury, but the fighter she could have become. Her stance was naturally balanced, her remaining good hand unconsciously held in a defensive position even during casual conversation. Mickey had been right about her potential. There was raw talent here, the kind that emerged maybe once in a generation. "Mickey tells me you want justice," Rocky said. "But justice and revenge, they ain't the same thing. What Romano did to you, it was wrong, evil even. But if I step into that ring with Thompson, it ain't gonna undo what happened to your wrist." "I know that," Sarah replied, "but maybe it'll stop him from doing it to the next girl, and the one after that, and the one after that." Her words hung in the air, carrying a weight that pressed against Rocky's conscience like a physical force. He had spent 15 years trying to convince himself that his fighting days were over, that he had earned the right to peace and quiet anonymity. But looking at Sarah's determined face, he realized that some fights chose you rather than the other way around. Mickey emerged from his office, carrying a stack of medical forms and insurance paperwork. The practical details of returning to boxing, even for a single exhibition match, were staggering. Drug tests and physical examinations, liability waivers and media releases, contracts written in language that protected everyone except the fighters themselves. "The exhibition's set for next Friday night," Mickey announced. Private venue, invitation-only crowd. Romano's charging $1,000 a ticket, and every seat's already sold. The fight's technically listed as a charity event, all proceeds supposedly going to some foundation for underprivileged youth. Rocky couldn't help but laugh at the irony. He's making money off violence against kids while pretending to help them. "That's Romano for you," Mickey said bitterly. "Every angle covered, every base protected. Even if something goes wrong, he's got plausible deniability built right into the event." Sarah had been listening to their conversation with growing frustration. So he wins either way. If Rocky fights and loses, Romano proves that even legends can't stand up to him. If Rocky fights and wins, Romano still made money off the whole thing, and probably has some other angle we haven't thought of yet. "Maybe," Rocky admitted. "But sometimes doing the right thing ain't about winning or losing. Sometimes it's just about showing up when showing up matters." The next several hours were spent in preparation that felt both familiar and alien to Rocky. His body remembered the rhythms of training, the way muscles responded to gradually increasing demands, the mental discipline required to push through fatigue and discomfort, the careful balance between confidence and humility that separated champions from casualties. But everything was slower now, more deliberate, marked by the accumulated wear and tear of a career spent absorbing punishment from the world's most dangerous men. Mickey worked with him on fundamentals, not trying to recapture past glories, but rather adapting proven techniques to current limitations. Rocky's reflexes weren't what they had been at 25 or 30 or even 40, but his ring IQ was deeper than ever. His understanding of distance and timing refined by decades of experience. He might not be able to match Thompson's youth and raw power, but he possessed something that couldn't be taught or purchased. The wisdom of a warrior who had faced every possible scenario and survived them all. As the day wore on, other fighters began to arrive for their regular training sessions. Word had spread through the boxing community with the speed of wildfire. Rocky Balboa was back in Mickey's gym, preparing for one final fight. They came not as spectators, but as witnesses, drawn by the need to see for themselves whether legends were real or merely stories told by old men in dusty gymnasiums. Sarah remained throughout the entire session, her broken wrist preventing her from participating, but her eyes never leaving Rocky's movements. She studied his footwork, his breathing patterns, the way he adapted classic combinations to work around physical limitations. In her mind, she was already incorporating these lessons into her own future training, preparing for the day when her wrist would heal and she could return to pursuing her dreams. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked during a break between rounds. Rocky considered the question while wiping sweat from his face with a towel that had probably been in the gym since before she was born. "You know, I've been asking myself that same thing. And I think the answer is that sometimes you got to stand up to bullies, even when it's dangerous, especially when it's dangerous, because if you don't, if you just let them keep hurting people, then you become part of the problem." Sarah nodded, understanding more than words could convey. In that moment, a bond was forged between the aging legend and the broken fighter, a connection that transcended age and gender and circumstance. They were both fighters, both dreamers, both people who refused to accept that evil should go unchallenged simply because challenging it was difficult or dangerous. As the sun began to set outside the gym's high windows, Rocky wrapped his hands one more time, feeling the familiar comfort of the cloth strips that had protected his fists through countless battles. One more fight. One more chance to prove that honor mattered more than money, that courage could triumph over cruelty, that even legends could find new reasons to be legendary. The warehouse in South Philadelphia's industrial district had been transformed into an underground coliseum, complete with a regulation boxing ring surrounded by rows of expensive folding chairs. The crowd that gathered for Romano's private exhibition represented the worst of Philadelphia's elite. Corrupt politicians, dirty cops, mob lawyers, and business executives who had never met a moral boundary they wouldn't cross for profit. They came with thick wallets and thin consciences, ready to be entertained by violence that existed in the grey areas between legal and criminal. Romano himself held court at ringside, dressed in a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He worked the crowd like the predator he was, accepting congratulations for organizing such an exclusive event, collecting side bets on the evening's main attraction, basking in the fearful respect of men who understood power even if they didn't possess it themselves. Marcus the Mauler Thompson shadowboxed in one corner of the makeshift arena, his massive frame rippling with muscle and malicious intent. At 26 years old, he was in the absolute prime of his physical capabilities, 6 feet 2 inches of perfectly conditioned violence, with a professional record of 18 wins, 0 losses, and 14 knockouts. More importantly, he possessed the kind of casual cruelty that made him perfectly suited to Romano's purposes. Thompson didn't just defeat opponents, he destroyed them, both physically and psychologically, leaving behind a trail of broken bones and shattered dreams that served as warnings to anyone who might consider challenging the established order. The crowd began to murmur with anticipation as the evening's preliminary matches concluded and the main event approached. Romano had promised them something special tonight, a demonstration of what happened to aging legends who forgot their place in the modern world. The betting had heavily favored Thompson from the beginning, with odds running as high as 20-1 against his mystery opponent. That's when Rocky Balboa stepped through the warehouse entrance. The reaction was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as heads turned to track the approaching figure. Even in this crowd of cynics and sociopaths, the name Rocky Balboa carried weight. He was a piece of Philadelphia history, a local boy made good who had transcended sports to become something approaching mythology. His presence transformed the evening from a simple exhibition into something with much higher stakes. Romano's smile faltered for just a moment as he realized what was happening. He had expected Mickey to find some desperate nobody, some washed-up never-was, who would provide easy prey for Thompson's particular talents. Instead, he was facing a living legend, a man whose very presence in the ring would attract attention from people Romano preferred to avoid. The kind of attention that came with newspaper headlines and television coverage, and questions from authorities who couldn't be easily bought or intimidated. But Romano was nothing if not adaptable. Within seconds, his smile had returned, broader and more predatory than before. If Rocky Balboa wanted to make this personal, then Romano would give him a lesson in what happened to relics who refused to stay buried. The betting odds would shift in Thompson's favor even more dramatically now, and the crowd would pay premium prices to witness the humiliation of a former champion. Rocky moved through the crowd with quiet dignity, ignoring the whispered comments and pointed stares that followed in his wake. He wore simple black trunks and boxing shoes that had seen better decades, his equipment as humble as his demeanor. There were no entourage members, no television cameras, no fanfare of any kind. Just an aging fighter preparing to step into the ring one more time for reasons that had nothing to do with money or glory. Mickey followed close behind, his weathered face set in grim determination. The old trainer had seen his share of dangerous fights over the years, had watched promising careers end in hospital beds and morgues, but he had never felt the weight of consequences heavily as he did tonight. This wasn't just about Sarah's broken wrist anymore. It was about the soul of boxing itself, about whether the sport they both loved could survive the corruption that threatened to consume it from within. Sarah Mitchell watched from the shadows near the warehouse entrance, having convinced Mickey to let her attend despite the obvious dangers. Her broken wrist was still encased in its cast, a visible reminder of the stakes involved in the evening's proceedings. She studied the faces in the crowd, memorizing the men who had paid money to watch violence, who supported Romano's empire of fear through their passive complicity. The ring announcer, a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting tuxedo, stepped to the center of the canvas with a wireless microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to an evening of exclusive boxing entertainment. Our main event features a special exhibition match between two fighters representing different generations of the sport." The crowd leaned forward in anticipation as Thompson climbed through the ropes, his movements fluid and intimidating. He raised his gloved hands above his head and smiled at the audience, revealing teeth that had been sharpened to points, a cosmetic modification that served no practical purpose except to enhance his reputation for savagery. Several people in the crowd cheered appreciatively, already imagining the damage those teeth might do to an opponent's flesh. "In the red corner," the announcer continued, weighing in at 212 pounds, with a professional record of 18 wins and 0 losses, representing Romano's athletic club, Marcus the Mauler Thompson. The crowd erupted in approval as Thompson flexed for their benefit, his massive shoulders and arms creating an intimidating silhouette against the harsh warehouse lighting. He had prepared for this moment, his entire professional career, the chance to cement his reputation by destroying a living legend in front of an audience that would spread the story throughout the boxing world. And in the blue corner, the announcer's voice dropped to a more respectful tone, weighing in at 197 pounds, with a professional record of 57 wins, 23 losses and 2 draws, former heavyweight champion of the world, Rocky Balboa. The warehouse fell silent, except for the distant hum of industrial ventilation systems. Rocky stepped through the ropes with the careful movements of a man whose body had absorbed decades of punishment. But there was something in his eyes that made even the most hardened spectators lean forward in their seats. This wasn't the desperate flailing of a has-been seeking one final moment of glory. This was the focused intensity of a warrior who had found one more reason to fight. Romano stood and walked to the edge of the ring, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet space. "Rocky, Rocky, Rocky," he called out with false friendliness. "You sure you want to do this, old man? It's not too late to walk away. Save yourself some pain. Save your legacy from being tarnished by an unnecessary beating." Rocky looked down at the man who had broken Sarah's wrist, who had terrorized an entire community, who represented everything toxic about the sport he loved. "Vincent," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness, "some things are more important than avoiding pain." "Like what?" "Like making sure bullies understand that there's always someone willing to stand up to them." The words hung in the air like a challenge, a declaration of war that everyone present understood completely. This wasn't going to be a simple exhibition match. It was a confrontation between two different philosophies, two different ways of viewing power and its proper use. Thompson grew tired of the talking and began bouncing on his toes, shadowboxing with increasing intensity. "Enough talk," he growled. "Let's see how tough the legendary Rocky Balboa really is when he's facing someone who doesn't care about his reputation." The referee, a former professional fighter who had been paid handsomely to ensure the evening went according to Romano's plan, called both men to the center of the ring. The contrast between them was stark. Thompson young and brutal and hungry, Rocky older and wiser, and carrying the weight of every principle he had ever believed in. "I want a clean fight," the referee said, though his tone suggested that cleanliness was optional. "Protect yourselves at all times, and may the best man win." Rocky returned to his corner where Mickey waited with last-minute advice and encouragement. The old trainer's hands shook slightly as he applied petroleum jelly to Rocky's face, a protective coating that would help gloves slide off rather than tear skin. "Remember what we worked on," Mickey whispered. "Don't try to match his power. You can't, not anymore. Use your experience, your ring IQ. Make him think, make him work, make him make mistakes." Rocky nodded, but his attention was focused on the crowd rather than his opponent. He saw Sarah watching from the shadows, her broken wrist a constant reminder of why he was here. He saw the faces of men who had paid money to watch violence, who supported Romano's empire through their passive complicity. He saw Mickey, whose faith in him had never wavered, despite 15 years of separation and silence. The bell rang to start the first round. Thompson came out of his corner like a hurricane given human form, his footwork aggressive and his combinations designed to overwhelm rather than outbox. He threw power shots from the opening bell, each punch carrying enough force to drop a lesser opponent, his strategy clearly focused on ending the fight quickly and brutally. The crowd leaned forward in anticipation of immediate violence, their bloodthirsty expectations sharpened by years of watching Thompson dismantle overmatched opponents. But Rocky wasn't there when the first combination arrived. Using footwork that was older than Thompson himself, Rocky slipped and slid and pivoted away from the incoming assault, his movements economical and precise. He didn't try to match his opponent's youth or power. Instead, he relied on decades of experience to stay just out of range while Thompson threw punch after punch at empty air. "Stand still and fight!" Thompson snarled, frustration already creeping into his voice. Rocky said nothing, continuing his defensive dance while studying his opponent's patterns. Thompson was powerful but predictable, telegraphing his punches with subtle shifts in weight and posture that an experienced fighter could read like a book. More importantly, he was already starting to breathe heavily, the curse of fighters who relied on pure aggression rather than tactical intelligence. Halfway through the first round, Rocky began to counter. Nothing spectacular or devastating, just sharp jabs and straight rights that found their targets, while Thompson was recovering from his own missed attacks. The punches weren't powerful enough to hurt the younger fighter, but they were accurate enough to score points, and more importantly, to send a message. The old man wasn't going to be an easy victim. Romano watched from ringside with growing unease. This wasn't the scenario he had envisioned. Thompson was supposed to destroy Rocky within the first 2 rounds, demonstrating the futility of standing up to Romano's organization. Instead, the aging champion was making his prize fighter look clumsy and desperate, turning what should have been an execution into something approaching an actual boxing match. The crowd began to murmur with uncertainty as the first round drew to a close. Thompson had thrown 3 punches for every one of Rocky's, but somehow looked worse for the exchange. His face was already showing the beginnings of swelling around the eyes, while Rocky appeared fresh and focused despite his advanced age. When the bell rang to end the round, Thompson stalked back to his corner in visible frustration, while Rocky walked calmly to where Mickey waited with water and advice. "You're making him mad," Mickey observed with satisfaction. "Good. Angry fighters make mistakes." "He's strong," Rocky replied, working his jaw to make sure nothing was loose or damaged. "Stronger than I expected. If he connects clean, this fight's over." "Then don't let him connect clean. You're boxing circles around him out there. Keep doing what you're doing, and let him punch himself tired." The second round began with Thompson attempting to implement a more measured approach, but his patience lasted approximately 30 seconds before frustration overwhelmed strategy. He began winging wild haymakers, each one capable of ending the fight, but none of them finding their target as Rocky continued his masterclass in defensive boxing. It was midway through the second round that Rocky began to change the dynamic of the fight. Instead of simply avoiding Thompson's attacks, he began to make him pay for them. Every missed combination was answered with a sharp counter, every moment of overextension punished with precise punches that accumulated damage like compound interest. Thompson's left eye was closing by the end of the second round, and his breathing had become labored. The crowd that had come to see Rocky's destruction was witnessing instead the systematic breakdown of their supposed destroyer. Romano's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence replaced by the dawning realization that his carefully orchestrated evening was spiraling out of control. "What's wrong, Marcus?" Rocky asked quietly, as they clinched near the end of the round. "Thought this was going to be easy?" Thompson responded with a low blow that drew a warning from the referee, but no other consequences. The message was clear. If he couldn't win cleanly, he would win dirty, and the officials weren't going to stop him. The third round brought a noticeable shift in Thompson's tactics. Unable to solve Rocky's defensive puzzle through conventional means, he began to employ the kind of techniques that had earned him his reputation as a destroyer rather than a boxer. Elbows disguised as punches, thumbs that found their way to Rocky's eyes, holding and hitting combinations that skirted the edge of what the corrupt referee would allow. Rocky absorbed the illegal tactics without complaint, understanding that this was exactly the kind of fight he had expected. Romano hadn't built his empire by following rules or respecting boundaries. He had succeeded by being more ruthless than his opposition, by escalating every conflict until his enemies either submitted or were destroyed. But as the round progressed, something interesting began to happen. The crowd, which had initially cheered for Thompson's dirty tactics, began to grow quiet. There was something unseemly about watching a young, powerful fighter resort to cheating against an opponent who was clearly past his physical prime. Even in a room full of criminals and corrupt officials, there were still some lines that generated discomfort when crossed. Sarah watched from the shadows with growing anger and admiration. Anger at Thompson's blatant rule-breaking and the referee's willingness to allow it. Admiration for Rocky's refusal to be drawn into the same kind of behavior. He was proving that it was possible to fight evil without becoming evil, to stand up to corruption without being corrupted in return. The fourth round began with Thompson throwing everything he had at Rocky, legal and illegal, conventional and desperate. He was starting to panic now, realizing that his reputation was on the line and that the easy victory he had been promised was slipping away with each passing minute. His punches became wider and wilder, his tactics more blatantly illegal, his breathing more labored, and that's when Rocky saw his opening. Thompson threw a massive overhand right that would have decapitated a statue if it had connected, but Rocky slipped it perfectly and countered with a straight left hand that caught the younger fighter flush on the jaw. The punch wasn't thrown with the devastating power that had once made Rocky famous. His body was no longer capable of generating that kind of force, but it was thrown with perfect timing and placement. The kind of punch that could only come from a fighter who had spent decades learning exactly when and where to strike. Thompson's knees buckled for just a moment, his eyes going glassy as he struggled to maintain his balance. The crowd gasped audibly, suddenly realizing that the impossible might actually be happening, that the aging legend might actually have enough left in his tank to defeat Romano's unbeatable champion. Romano jumped to his feet at ringside, his composure finally cracking completely. "Finish him!" he screamed at Thompson. "Stop playing games and finish him!" But Thompson was no longer in a position to finish anyone. Rocky's counter had done more than just hurt him physically. It had shattered the psychological advantage that had carried him through 18 previous victories. For the first time in his professional career, Marcus Thompson was facing an opponent who wasn't afraid of him, who couldn't be intimidated or overwhelmed, who possessed something that couldn't be taught or purchased or stolen: the heart of a champion. The fifth round began with Thompson desperate and dangerous, a wounded animal backed into a corner with nothing left to lose. His earlier tactical approach had been abandoned completely in favor of raw aggression, fueled by panic, and Romano's increasingly frantic instructions from ringside. He charged forward with reckless abandon, throwing combinations that were more about self-preservation than strategic boxing, each punch carrying the weight of his crumbling reputation. Rocky met the assault with the calm precision of a master craftsman. Every movement was deliberate and economical, his feet positioned exactly where they needed to be, his hands moving in perfect coordination to deflect and counter. This was boxing reduced to its purest essence, the marriage of physical technique and mental discipline that separated true champions from mere athletes. The crowd had grown increasingly quiet as the fight progressed, their initial bloodlust replaced by something approaching respect. What they were witnessing wasn't the brutal beating they had paid to see, but rather a clinic in the sweet science, a demonstration of how skill and experience could triumph over youth and power when properly applied. Thompson's face was a mess by now. His left eye completely closed, his lip split and bleeding, his nose flattened and swollen. But the physical damage was nothing compared to the psychological impact of facing an opponent who refused to be intimidated or overwhelmed. Every punch he threw seemed to be anticipated, every combination neutralized with movements that appeared effortless but required decades to master. "Why won't you go down?" Thompson gasped during a clinch, his frustration boiling over into desperation. "Because," Rocky replied quietly, "going down was never an option." The sixth round brought a shift in Romano's strategy. Unable to rely on Thompson's boxing skills to deliver the promised victory, he began signaling for more extreme measures. The corrupt referee, who had already allowed numerous illegal tactics to pass without penalty, began to position himself to provide cover for increasingly blatant rule violations. It started with extended clinching that the referee was slow to break, giving Thompson opportunities to land short punches to Rocky's kidneys and ribs. Then came the low blows that were ruled accidental despite their obvious intent. By the middle of the round, Thompson was throwing elbows and forearms with the referee, turning a blind eye to every illegal technique. Rocky absorbed the punishment without complaint, understanding that this was exactly the kind of corruption he had come to expose. Every illegal blow, every unpunished foul, every moment of obvious bias from the official was proof of the systematic rot that had infected the sport he loved. But more importantly, it was proof that Romano's organization could only maintain power through cheating and intimidation. They had no answer for honest competition. Sarah watched from the shadows with a mixture of anger and admiration that threatened to overwhelm her composure. The broken wrist that had brought her to this moment throbbed in sympathy with every illegal blow Rocky absorbed, but she could see something in his face that transcended physical pain. He wasn't just fighting Thompson. He was fighting for every young boxer who had ever been intimidated by corrupt promoters. Every dreamer who had been told that talent wasn't enough in a world where connections mattered more than character. The seventh round brought the evening's most dramatic moment. Thompson, now completely exhausted and operating on pure adrenaline and desperation, threw a wild overhand right that Rocky slipped easily. But instead of simply avoiding the punch, Rocky stepped inside and landed a perfect uppercut to Thompson's solar plexus. A blow that doubled the younger fighter over and left him gasping for air like a drowning man. The crowd erupted in surprise as Thompson staggered backward, his face a mask of shock and pain. For a moment, it looked like the fight might be over. Thompson's legs were shaking, his gloves hanging at his sides, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw breath. The uppercut hadn't been thrown with devastating power, but it had been perfectly timed and placed, finding the one spot where even a conditioned athlete was vulnerable. Romano screamed instructions from ringside, his composure completely shattered. "Get up! Fight back! Do something!" But Thompson was discovering what every opponent who had ever faced Rocky Balboa had learned the hard way, that some fighters possessed a kind of will that transcended physical limitations, a refusal to be beaten that couldn't be explained by training or technique or natural ability. It was the heart of a champion, and it was the one thing that money couldn't buy. The referee moved to check on Thompson, ostensibly concerned for the fighter's welfare, but actually providing him with additional recovery time. The corrupt official made a show of examining Thompson's eyes and asking if he could continue, using every second to allow Romano's champion to regain his composure. Rocky stood in the neutral corner and waited patiently, understanding the game being played but refusing to protest. He had come here to prove a point, not to win by technicality or default. When Thompson finally indicated that he could continue, Rocky simply nodded and prepared for whatever desperate measures would come next. The 8th round began with Thompson throwing everything he had left in one final desperate assault. His punches were wilder than ever, his technique completely abandoned in favor of raw aggression. But there was something different about his approach now. The cocky smile was gone, replaced by the grim determination of a man who finally understood that he was in a real fight against a real opponent. Rocky met the assault with the same calm precision he had displayed throughout the evening, but there was something different about his approach as well. The defensive tactics that had dominated the early rounds were gradually giving way to more aggressive counterpunching, as if he had finally taken the measure of his opponent and found him wanting. The crowd sensed the shift in momentum and began to buzz with anticipation. They had come expecting to see Rocky Balboa humiliated and destroyed, but instead they were witnessing the systematic dismantling of Romano's supposedly unbeatable champion. More importantly, they were seeing proof that corruption and intimidation could be defeated by courage and skill when properly applied. As the round drew to a close, Rocky landed a crisp left hook to Thompson's jaw that sent the younger fighter staggering into the ropes. The punch wasn't devastating, but it was perfectly timed and placed. Another reminder that experience and intelligence could overcome youth and power when combined with unshakable will. Thompson's corner worked frantically between rounds, applying ice to his swollen face and offering desperate advice about how to turn the fight around. But everyone in the warehouse could see the truth. Marcus the Mauler Thompson was being systematically outboxed by a man old enough to be his father, and there was nothing anyone could do to change that fundamental reality. Romano stood at ringside with his face pale and his hands shaking, watching his carefully constructed evening of dominance transform into a public demonstration of his organization's weakness. The betting odds that had heavily favored Thompson at the beginning of the evening were now shifting dramatically in Rocky's direction, and the crowd that had come to celebrate corruption was instead witnessing its exposure. The 9th round would bring the climax of the evening's drama, and everyone present understood that they were about to witness something that would be talked about in boxing circles for decades to come. The 9th round began with an almost supernatural silence, as if the entire warehouse was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Thompson emerged from his corner looking like a man walking to his own execution, his face a swollen mask of purple and crimson, his earlier confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of someone who had finally encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through violence and intimidation. Rocky moved to the center of the ring with the measured steps of a man who had found his rhythm and his purpose. The accumulated fatigue of 8 hard rounds showed in the slight slump of his shoulders and the deliberate nature of his movements. But his eyes remained sharp and focused, burning with an intensity that transcended physical limitation. Romano had abandoned all pretense of calm control, screaming instructions from ringside that bordered on hysteria. "Hurt him! Do whatever it takes! I don't care what you have to do! Just hurt him!" The corrupt referee positioned himself to provide maximum cover for whatever illegal tactics Thompson might employ, his earlier attempts at maintaining professional appearance completely abandoned in favor of blatant bias. The fix was in, and everyone present understood that Rocky would receive no protection from official interference. Thompson charged forward with the desperate aggression of a drowning man, throwing punches with no regard for technique or defense. His strategy had devolved into pure chaos. If he couldn't outbox Rocky Balboa, he would try to overwhelm him through sheer brutality. Elbows mixed with gloves, headbutts disguised as clinches, low blows that went completely unpunished by the referee. But something remarkable was happening. Instead of being overwhelmed by the illegal tactics, Rocky seemed to grow stronger with each foul, more focused with each unpunished transgression. Every dirty trick Thompson employed, every moment of obvious corruption from the referee, every screamed instruction from Romano only served to crystallize his purpose and sharpen his resolve. This was bigger than boxing now. This was about every time power had tried to crush justice, every moment when corruption had assumed that fear would triumph over courage, every instance when bullies had believed that their victims would remain silent and compliant. Rocky wasn't just fighting Thompson. He was fighting for every person who had ever been told they were powerless against systematic abuse. Midway through the round, Thompson landed a particularly vicious combination that sent Rocky staggering backward, blood flowing from a cut above his left eye. The crowd gasped, and Romano smiled for the first time all evening, sensing that his champion might finally be gaining the upper hand through sheer brutality. But as Rocky wiped the blood from his eye and looked across the ring at Thompson, something shifted in the atmosphere of the warehouse. The aging champion wasn't looking at his opponent with fear or concern. He was looking at him with something approaching pity. "Is that all you got?" Rocky asked quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. Thompson's face contorted with rage and desperation. He charged forward again, throwing the wildest combination of his professional career, every punch designed to end the fight immediately. But Rocky wasn't there when the punches arrived. Using footwork that belonged in a textbook, he slipped and countered with a perfect left hook to Thompson's liver. The body shot, landed with a sound like a baseball bat hitting a side of beef, and Thompson's entire body convulsed in response. His hands dropped instinctively to protect his midsection, leaving his head completely exposed for the straight right hand that followed. Rocky's right cross caught Thompson flush on the jaw with every ounce of skill and experience he possessed. It wasn't the most powerful punch he had ever thrown. His aging body was no longer capable of generating that kind of force, but it was perfectly timed, perfectly placed, and delivered with the accumulated authority of a lifetime spent in boxing rings. Thompson's eyes rolled back in his head as his knees buckled. He tried to grab the ropes for support, but his coordination was gone. His strength sapped by 8 rounds of futile aggression against an opponent who had refused to be intimidated or overwhelmed. He fell forward onto his face with a sound that echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. The referee, caught off guard by the sudden ending, stood frozen for several seconds before beginning his count. But everyone present could see that Thompson wasn't getting up. He lay motionless on the canvas, his chest rising and falling in the shallow rhythm of someone who had been completely and utterly defeated. 1, 2, 3, 4. Romano rushed to the edge of the ring, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. This wasn't supposed to happen. His unbeatable champion wasn't supposed to be lying unconscious on the canvas while an aging legend stood over him in triumph. The carefully orchestrated evening of dominance had become a public humiliation that would destroy his reputation and undermine his authority. 5, 6, 7. The crowd had gone completely silent, except for the referee's count. These men had come expecting to witness the destruction of a legend, but instead they were seeing the birth of something new, proof that corruption could be defeated, that intimidation had limits, that there were still people in the world who would stand up to bullies regardless of the personal cost. 8, 9. Thompson stirred slightly, but made no attempt to rise. His body might have been willing to continue, but his spirit had been broken as completely as Sarah's wrist. He had built his entire identity around being unbeatable, and that illusion had been shattered by a man who possessed something Thompson had never understood: the heart of a true champion. 10. Rocky Balboa had won. The warehouse erupted in chaos as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Romano's supporters looked around nervously, suddenly aware that their association with corruption had been exposed in the most public way possible. The corrupt referee seemed unsure of what to do next, his script having been torn up by an outcome that nobody had anticipated. But in the center of it all, Rocky stood quietly over his fallen opponent, not celebrating or gloating, but simply breathing heavily and trying to process what he had just accomplished. At 58 years old, after 15 years of retirement, he had stepped into the ring one more time and proven that some things, honor, courage, justice, were worth any amount of personal sacrifice. Sarah pushed through the crowd toward the ring, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the impossible made real. Her broken wrist no longer seemed like the end of her dreams, but rather the beginning of something larger, proof that evil could be confronted and defeated by those brave enough to stand up to it. Mickey climbed through the ropes and embraced his old friend, both men understanding that they had just witnessed something that transcended sports or entertainment. They had seen good triumph over evil in its purest form, and that victory would resonate far beyond the walls of this warehouse. Romano stood at ringside in stunned silence, his empire of fear revealed to be nothing more than an illusion that disappeared the moment someone refused to be afraid. The aftermath of the fight unfolded like a slow-motion earthquake, its reverberations spreading far beyond the warehouse walls into every corner of Philadelphia's boxing community. Within hours of Rocky's victory, social media exploded with grainy cell phone footage of the knockout, transforming what Romano had intended as a private demonstration of power into a very public exposure of his organization's corruption. The video went viral with a speed that surprised everyone, shared by thousands of people who had never thrown a punch, but understood the symbolic importance of what they had witnessed. Romano stood in the empty warehouse at 3 a.m, staring at the ring where his supposedly unbeatable champion had been knocked unconscious by a man old enough to collect Social Security. The crowd had dispersed quickly after the fight, his wealthy supporters melting away into the night with the practiced efficiency of people who understood when to abandon a sinking ship. The corrupt referee had disappeared without collecting his payment, suddenly unwilling to be associated with an evening that had become a public relations disaster. Marcus Thompson had been taken to the hospital with a severe concussion, his undefeated record and intimidating reputation destroyed in a single moment of perfectly timed violence. But the physical damage to his career was nothing compared to the psychological impact of being dominated by an opponent he had expected to demolish. Word was already spreading through the boxing world that the Mauler had been systematically outboxed and knocked out by a 58-year-old retiree, effectively ending his prospects as a legitimate championship contender. More importantly, the other fighters in Romano's stable were beginning to ask questions about their contracts and their treatment, emboldened by the proof that their supposedly invincible patron was neither invincible nor deserving of their fear. Phone calls were being made to rival promoters. Legal documents were being reviewed by attorneys who hadn't been purchased, and for the first time in years, Vincent Romano was discovering what it felt like to have his authority questioned. Rocky sat in Mickey's gym as dawn broke over Philadelphia, an ice pack pressed against his swollen face, while Sarah held his other hand in both of hers. The aging champion had absorbed more punishment than he cared to admit, his ribs aching from Thompson's body shots and his head pounding from the accumulated impact of 8 rounds of professional boxing. But beneath the physical discomfort was a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with purpose. "You did it," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You actually did it." "We did it," Rocky corrected gently. "You're the one who had the courage to stand up to him first. All I did was finish what you started." Mickey worked quietly in the corner, cleaning and organizing equipment with the methodical precision of someone who had spent 70 years in boxing gyms. The old trainer hadn't said much since the fight ended, but Rocky could see the satisfaction in his weathered features, the quiet pride of someone who had witnessed justice served in its purest form. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. It was a fair question, one that Rocky had been considering since the moment Thompson hit the canvas. Romano's organization wouldn't simply disappear overnight. Too many people had too much invested in the current system for immediate change to be possible. But cracks had appeared in the foundation, and cracks had a way of spreading when pressure was applied in the right places. "Now," Rocky said slowly, "we go back to work. You heal up, get back to training, start chasing those scholarships again. Mickey keeps running his gym the right way, giving kids a place where they can learn to box without having to worry about predators. And me," he paused, considering his words carefully, "maybe I stick around for a while, make sure nobody else gets hurt while the dust settles." The implications of that statement hung in the air like smoke. Rocky Balboa was officially coming out of retirement, not to chase another championship or relive past glories, but to serve as a guardian angel for young fighters who needed protection from the corruption that had nearly destroyed Sarah's dreams. Over the following weeks, the story of the warehouse fight continued to spread and grow, taking on mythic proportions with each retelling. Newspaper reporters who hadn't covered boxing in years suddenly found themselves writing feature articles about corruption in professional sports. Television producers began developing documentaries about Romano's organization and the fighters who had been exploited by his system of intimidation and control. The Boxing Commission, faced with overwhelming public pressure and media scrutiny, launched a formal investigation into Romano's business practices. Judges and referees who had been taking bribes found themselves under federal investigation. Gym owners who had been paying protection money suddenly discovered they had legal recourse against their tormentors. Most importantly, young fighters across the city began to understand that they didn't have to accept abuse as the price of pursuing their dreams. Sarah's broken wrist became a symbol not of victimization, but of resistance, proof that even the most powerful predators could be brought down by courage and determination. Romano himself disappeared from public view, his empire collapsing under the weight of investigations and defections. The man who had once terrorized an entire community found himself isolated and powerless, his money and connections worthless against the tide of justice that Rocky's victory had unleashed. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell stepped into the ring for her first amateur bout since the attack, her wrist fully healed and her spirit stronger than ever. Rocky was in her corner, offering quiet advice and steady encouragement, while Mickey worked her corner with the expertise of someone who had trained champions. The crowd included dozens of young fighters from gyms across Philadelphia, all of whom understood that they were witnessing something more than a simple boxing match. When Sarah won by unanimous decision, the victory belonged to everyone who had ever been told they were powerless against systematic abuse. It belonged to every dreamer who had refused to accept that talent wasn't enough in a corrupt world. It belonged to anyone who had ever believed that good could triumph over evil when good people found the courage to fight. The story ends not with a single moment of triumph, but with an ongoing commitment to justice and protection. Rocky Balboa had stepped out of retirement one final time, not for glory or money or personal satisfaction, but to prove that legends are made not by what they accomplish for themselves, but by what they sacrifice for others. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't about knocking down your opponent, it's about helping someone else stand up. And in a world where power often tries to crush justice, where corruption assumes that fear will triumph over courage, sometimes you need an old fighter to show you that the heart of a champion beats strongest when it's fighting for someone else. The broken girl became whole. The legend became eternal, and justice for once wore boxing gloves. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that courage can triumph over corruption, share it with someone who needs to hear that they're not powerless against injustice. Comment below about a time when you or someone you know stood up to a bully. Let's build a community of people who refuse to stay silent when others are being hurt. And don't forget to subscribe, because we're just getting started telling stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it matters most.